All right, now that we've safely got on board the airplane together, we didn't get told to fasten our seatbelts, but good morning and welcome to the Scottish Parliament. I'm absolutely delighted to see a very full room for a conversation around reshaping local government, and it's, I think, one of the first sessions of this amazing festival of politics. So I'm Ariane Burgess. I'm the convener of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee, and today we're going to be asking this fundamental question: is Scotland's current local government structure fit for the next 30 years? So we've already had 30 years almost, and what are we going to be doing in the future? And I think this is a conversation that certainly since I've been in this role is something we've been having, and I'm really keen to hear what folks on the panel have to say about that. So it's been 3 decades since the last major reorganisation, an event that was both ambitious and controversial, and since then the creation of the Scottish Parliament has reshaped the political landscape. But has it strengthened local government? And our panel brings together leading voices in civic governance, community involvement, local democracy, and public service innovation to explore how Scotland's local government can evolve to meet the challenges of the next 30 years. And I think the next 30 years are going to be very different from the 30 years that we've just been through. So I'm very pleased to be joined by Esther Robertson, who's a governance expert and lifelong public service leader, most recently as chair of NHS Lothian, and is currently serving on the board of the Scottish Futures Forum. Andy Whiteman, who's a writer, researcher, and former MSP, whose work on land governance and democracy includes leading the Who Owns Scotland project and championing local government reform. And we're joined online by Dr. Greg Stride, who's the principal researcher for the Local Government Information Unit, where he leads research projects on democracy, local government finance, and public administration. And finally, in the room, Councillor Gail McGregor, a Conservative councillor serving the Annandale North Ward in Dumfries and Galloway since 2007, and she's COSLA's Environment and Economy spokesperson. So a warm welcome to everyone on the panel. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, this thoughtful and engaging discussion today. It's important that everyone feels welcome to share their views, even where opinions may differ. And let's ensure that we listen to one another with respect and create a space where all contributions are valued. And we'll begin with opening reflections from each of our panelists, followed by discussion exploring some key themes, and then we're going to open it to the floor for your questions and insights. So get that bit of your brain going as the conversation on the panel happens. So if you are keen to share your thoughts on your socials, get your mobile phones out, and you can do that using @VisitScottParl and @ScottFutures on X or Instagram. Or Instagram is actually Scott Parle, @ScottParl. And I should also add that this event is being recorded and will be available on the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Futures Forum YouTube channels in a few weeks. So I'm going to start with everyone on the panel having 2 minutes. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. We've got quite a lot of questions, but they're going to have 2 minutes to explore kind of an initial theme. And then we'll move to a number of questions that I have for them. And they've got 1 minute each to respond to those questions. So we're going to keep it quite tight. And then we will open it up to you. So we're making sure that there is input from the floor. So the first, the first question really is the kind of opening theme one is, I'd be interested to hear if you think local government needs to change, and then we'll get into some of the questions, we'll get into maybe some of the detail of that. So I think I'll just start with Esther, move across, and then Greg, I'll come on to you online last, but I will make sure that you're not always last. I know what that's like. Okay, Esther.
2 minutes. So 30 years seems to be very significant. We were discussing it earlier because 30 years ago this year, the Scottish Constitutional Convention scheme for the Parliament was launched. And most of Civic Scotland and most of the political parties signed up to that scheme, which included a really clear commitment that devolution would not stop in Edinburgh. that a newly created Parliament would revisit local government and local governance, including the Quango state, and follow the principle of that awful word subsidiarity, making sure that having a Parliament then led to putting power in the hands of the people of Scotland. So, does it need to change? In a view, yes, absolutely. We have the biggest councils in Europe, and we have some that are too big to be local and others that are too small to be strategic. But all of them are disconnected from the communities they serve. So, since my involvement in the convention, it's been a campaign of mine to get back to that commitment, because 30 years on, despite me promising people all over the country that a Parliament would not suck up powers from local government, I was completely wrong, and subsequent Parliaments have done exactly that and centralised more and more, so that local government no longer has the powers it needs over finance or over the things that they can deliver. And if we're serious about addressing many of the challenges that we currently face, I firmly believe that the answers lie in powerful local governance connected to communities that people feel they have some control over.
Well, thanks very much for that response, and I think it's really fantastic that you're willing to acknowledge that what we've seen with the Scottish Parliament coming into the mix hasn't really done what you hoped it would do. So
I promised it would do,
yes,
so I got it wrong.
And that's a great sign of humility and really listening to what's going on. Andy.
Okay, thanks. Well, I suppose, so what's the question? Does it need to change? Yes, of course it does need to change. Yes, because it's not local, and arguably it doesn't govern. I mean, much of what local government does is deliver services. It doesn't actually govern. I mean, I was in Torridon Youth Hostel recently. It's interesting, there was a plaque on the wall saying, in fact, they're just about to celebrate their 50th anniversary. So Torridon Youth Hostel was established on land gifted by the National Trust for Scotland, and it was established under powers under the Countryside Act 1967 by Ross and Cromarty District Council. And they were doing stuff like that, building youth hostels, promoting the tourism economy. They had the powers and they had the will to do it because it was like normal. And that's all disappeared. I mean, I'm not reflecting on 30 years. I kind of forget 30 years. I'm reflecting on 50, when we lost all of our local government. We lost 192 councils. And it's funny because it was on the 15th of May 1975 that happened. So that was 50 years ago, a couple of months ago. And I wrote a blog about it. And I thought there's some media coverage. The only other comment in the Scottish media was a column by Brian Wilson. So only me in a blog and Brian Wilson in a column was actually reflecting on the fact that we'd demolished local government 50 years ago. You go back further, you go back to 1929 when we abolished parish councils. You know, we actually used to have what is commonplace in most European countries at the municipality or commune level. That'd be 1929, that'll be the next anniversary as a centenary. So yes, I agree with Esther. Local government needs to be a motor and an engine of local communities, and it's not. And to my mind, that's the fundamental problem.
Okay, thank you. And Gail?
Yeah, so I've been a councillor for 18 years now, and not the 30, but the changes that we've seen just in the time that I've been a councillor is immeasurable. I'll give you one example. When I became councillor in 2007, 10% of kids in schools needed additional support for learning assistance. It's 35% now. So local government absolutely has to change. There's no question of that. The services and the pressure on what councils are delivering is growing every day. My region has an ageing demographic. It has lower, or rather higher, people that are economically inactive, and that has a cost to our council. And all councils are different, and I represent 32 through my role at COSLA. But we have to look at how we can work closer to our communities, not further away. And I think what we've found over the last 10, 12 years is that centralisation is taking away a lot of decision making at local level. We have the knowledge, we understand our communities. We are on the front line. I attend my community council meetings and parent council meetings. I understand what my communities need. And I feel that over the last 10, 12 years, for sure, there's been more centralisation and more policies and strategies being imposed upon local government without the understanding. So when we co-created the 1140 nursery hours, really good example of local government and Scottish government working together to get a model. But when we went to do the free school meal rollout as another example, that was a diktat from government and it didn't work, and local government wasn't able to deliver. So I think the key for me is that we have to change. We have to look at what we absolutely need to deliver, and those crucial frontline services we absolutely do. And then we need to look at the areas around that where perhaps working with partners in other parts of the public sector is equally important.
Thanks for that. I think certainly in my role as convener of the local government committee, that's something, what you talk about, that there's more being given to councils to do, that we sit here in Parliament and create legislation, and I wonder how many times we've created a bit of legislation that at the last minute there's an amendment that goes, oh, let's make local authorities do this. So one of the things that I've been doing together with SPICE is trying to identify all the plans that come out of bits of legislation, and how do we start to create coherence across plans. You know, Good Food Nation Act, Empowerment Act, both had food plans. Unfortunately, those have been combined now. But what else are there where local authorities have to come up with lots of plans that actually you could put them together? So I think there's a bit of work we need to do there. Greg, come on in.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to speak here today. I think over the next 30 years, we have some idea about the inevitable changes that will happen across the world. And I think it's fair to say that local government in Scotland does have to change, but also that all governments in all democracies across the world will have to change. Can people hear me all right? Just to check. Yeah, okay.
Better. Yes.
Okay, perfect. If we look at what we can expect to happen over the next 30 years, we've got significant demographic changes, particularly an aging population, which will change how we deliver social services and education. We're getting to a situation very soon where we'll be spending more on pensions than we are on education. So demographic change will be huge. We look at technological change that's happening at a more and more rapid rate as time goes by. The last 30 years have been fast, but it's inevitable, in my view at least, that the next 30 years will be even faster in terms of technological change. We have climate change on the horizon. That will change lots and lots of things that local government has to produce, and particularly in cases like island councils, where it is connected to the climate in a way that is inextricable. And then we have changes in the expectations of citizens, and we can see this internationally in what citizens expect local government to be able to do. And the good thing about all of this is that local government should, in theory, be in a good position to change and adapt rapidly because it's closer to communities. But the question that we have to face here is Scottish local government in a situation where it can adapt? Is it flexible and empowered and financially empowered in a way that it will need to be in order to meet these challenges?
Okay, thanks for that. I would say that we did see an example of that during COVID, where local government, local authorities were able to adapt very quickly if given the opportunity to do that. But you certainly kind of highlight some pretty serious things that we're going to be facing, the tech changes and climate change. That's not new. That's an ongoing piece of work. I'm going to move into the questions now that we've set the scene. And I hope that you are all busy brewing some questions for when we come to you. So Andy, I'm going to start with you. And so the question is, almost 30 years on, and we have been starting to touch on this, almost 30 years on from the 1996 reorganisation, what have been the most significant successes and failures of the current local government structure in Scotland? And I would say maybe you don't need to cover them all because there's 4 of you. And so between all of you, we might cover some of them.
Well, I suppose one of the successes is local government's still there. And that's not a given. I mean, I've been reading some comments in cabinet papers from governments prior to 2000, and they come out after 15 years. There are people in this building here who don't like local government. So it survived. I suppose that's something to be thankful for. So what was the question? What's it?
What are the significant successes and failures?
Okay. I suppose a systemic failure, and this is not, I'm not pinning the blame on councils or anybody else about this, is a failure to build what I was describing as this kind of engine of local power, to build that local state, to build that strong local state that people feel connected with. They can feel angry about it, they can be really annoyed at the decisions that are made and whatever, but they feel they've got the capacity to do stuff in their community. And I think that's been the biggest failing, is we despite acts that try and do it, etc., we haven't got to that situation.
Okay, thanks. So we've got one strong failure. Maybe we can find some successes along the way too. Gail, I'm going to come to you next.
Yeah, I'll maybe try and be a bit more positive. Successes, I think the one good thing, particularly through COSLA, is that we have 32 council leaders sit in a room every month. And that structure enables us to make good decisions, but also gives us mass when we're coming to government to negotiate things. So I think that that's been a success in recent years. We're working on the Verity House Agreement at the moment, which is very much a work in progress, but it's given us a space with government to create much more open discussion and much more collaboration. There's a few areas that we rarely agree on and never will, but I think that that's been a huge success. I think in terms of failure, what we've probably not done is keep ourselves, as I said earlier, at the heart of our communities. And I think the multi-member ward system has impacted on that as well, which came in 2007. So, you know, my previous ward would have been one town and everybody would have known their local councillor. Now I cover a vast area that stretches from south of Lockerbie to north of Moffat, and people get confused about who their councillor is and who to contact. So I think that probably has been a bit of a failure within the structure, that the multi-member ward, it was put in place for good reason at the time, but again, it makes you more disconnected from your communities. So I think that's not been a huge success.
Yeah, that kind of confusion among voters and constituents. It's the same with MSPs as well. I'm constantly having to say to people, you have 8 MSPs. Most people don't know that. Greg, come on in.
Yeah, so I want to echo Andy's point first about survival being a success story, and particularly when we compare Scotland's local government system to the nearest closest comparator, which is England, where not every local government has survived. We've seen widespread what are known as bankruptcies, Section 114 notices, where councils can't afford to continue to be an ongoing concern, and we've seen restructuring because of that. So the survival of every individual council for now is also something to celebrate, I would say. And I would also echo the point that you made earlier, Ariane, about COVID. So I think one of the major successes of local government in the last few years is responding to the pandemic in a way that was fast, adapting in a way that empowered, so local government was sort of given additional fiscal powers or basically more resources for a while that meant that it could tackle COVID in a way that national governments really struggled to. So local government there was majorly successful. I would say the failure that I would point to, one of the major failures, and it's not necessarily local government's fault, is failure to live up to the potential that local government could have. And particularly there, I'm thinking in terms of things like prevention or the integration of public services or community empowerment, where we all know that local government could be doing more, but at this stage, it's not necessarily in a position to do it.
Okay, thanks. And Esther?
Let's deal with the negatives first, and then I'll come to the positives, because I think there are some. But I think the negatives and the failures actually aren't failures of local government itself, it's failures of the structure. So you talked about ward scale, and you're quite right. We have wards that are 10,000 people. In most European countries, that's the size of a council, not the size of a ward. So I think there are whole issues there. And the other is about local government finance. The tax powers that the Parliament have are restricted, we know that, but actually there are all sorts of powers that lie in local government if the Scottish Parliament were willing to make that happen. But there is a whole issue about power and control and all the rest. But the other side of the argument, and the success for me, I've said all along, I think we want really local councils. We also want strategic councils. But those local councils will mean nothing if they continue to operate in a top-down, let's do things to our communities. There are really good examples in East Ayrshire and Clackmannanshire and elsewhere of councils already that are very large, but are finding really innovative ways to engage with their local communities and give their communities a say over what actually happens there. In East Ayrshire, the Vibrant Community Programme allowed the community to develop the programme for their area and present it to the council, not the other way around. So unless we get really local councils that take that participative approach, we won't necessarily have achieved as much as we could.
And in a way, local place plans, that's really, I think that's an incredible democratic step. And what would be fantastic is to make sure that those are actually honoured. And talking to councils, I do get the sense, of planning authorities, I do get the sense that, yes, they are keen to support those.
As long as the local place plans have properly engaged the communities.
Well, that's right. And also as long as everyone's doing them, and not all communities are doing local place plans. So that, I think there's more support that needs to happen there. Gail, I'm going to come to you with the next question. And in a way, again, we've started to touch on this. So I'd be interested to hear from you and others on the panel around has the creation and consolidation of the Scottish Parliament strengthened or weakened local government, and how should the balance of power evolve? And I'm glad you did talk about the Verity House agreement in your response before.
I think it's been challenging, very challenging. I think one of the panelists, perhaps Andy, mentioned that the Scottish Parliament doesn't always like local government, and we're very aware of that. I think we have challenges, particularly when we are developing policies and strategies nationally, that sometimes there's a feeling that our MSPs don't truly understand what we're delivering on the front line, and I'm being very blunt about that. So I think that we as local councillors and local government need to engage cross-party across the entire Parliament so that MSPs understand the implications that some of those policies are going to have on us. And I think that key working together is going to help us to deliver. Going back to the COVID situation where we were kind of left to get on with it ourselves, that was a massive success story. You know, Business Gateway mobilised and helped businesses. You know, we were able to get on and do. One of the struggles I think that we have as local government is that we're going at 100 miles an hour delivering services every day just to stand still. So I think that reorganisation is difficult when you have less staff all continually doing more work than they've ever done before as well. So I think the Scottish Parliament needs to understand that.
Okay, that's good. We'll have to look at how we can do that. Greg?
Yeah, I just want to say from an international perspective, it's worth remembering that Scotland is one of the most centralised nations in the entire world, comparable only really in terms of large democracies with England and Wales, which are also extremely centralised. And I think we can look there at how things have developed in each of these different nations since devolution in the 1990s, and essentially local government finds itself in roughly the same financial and constitutional position in Scotland as it is in England, where there is no national parliament. So we're in a situation now where it's quite difficult to see exactly how a Scottish Parliament has empowered local government, or whether there's an empowerment of local government if it's in roughly the same situation as it is in England. However, having said that, there has never been an equivalent to Verity House in England. And I think that was a moment where we could start to say, well, okay, potentially there is a way that COSLA and the Scottish Government and these different organisations can work together in a way that it would be impossible without another level of government there. So I think there is a platform there that could be working to help. But I mean, I'll leave it to the rest of the panel, perhaps throughout this discussion, to decide on whether Verity House has been a success in the last couple of years.
Thank you. And Esther?
I think the answer is, sadly, it's weakened local government. There's absolutely no doubt. What I would challenge, though, is it the Scottish Parliament that's weakened, or is it the Scottish Government that have weakened local government? And obviously the Parliament has a key role. I didn't know there were people in this building that don't like local government. What I do know is there are civil servants in St Andrew's House that don't understand local government and see it just as a delivery arm for Scottish Government, not as a democratically elected group in its own right. So I think there's a whole raft of misunderstandings, some deliberate, some not, about the role. But it's definitely been weakened. Local government gets more and more to do with less and less money and less power. And we were discussing earlier the techie thing about the European Charter of Local Self-Governance. The Parliament was established on the convention scheme that committed to that. And that would start with saying local councils have the power to do whatever is right for their local communities. And it's for them to decide confederally what powers need to be moved back up to strategic local authorities or to a parliament and a government. So it's weakened by a long chalk, and it's really long overdue that we get back to addressing that and put power back where it belongs in local communities.
Okay. Okay, so that's us talking about the role of and the impact of Scottish Parliament, and I'm thank you for saying Scottish Government as well, because I think that is where a lot of the bits of legislation initially come from, is the Scottish Government. Greg, I'm going to come to you with the next question, and that's around if we were shifting power, what do we want to look at? So is the current council model with 32 unitary authorities still fit for purpose, or should we consider more radical restructuring?
I think we have to consider more radical restructuring. I mean, the issue is that, I mean, it's one of the fundamental tensions of democracies across the world, which is that democracies work better when they're small, but economies and public services tend to work better on an economy of scale. So they tend to be better when they're big. That's not necessarily true because they can be less adaptable. They tend to be, they tend to be cheaper when they're big. And that's maybe what the efficiencies that some governments are looking for across the world. So we're in a sort of a core tension there where we have to look at the issue of balance. And I think in the case of local government, at least in terms of when we're talking about efficiencies that can be gained through personalisation, which is probably what the future of care is. That is a case where being local and closer to the people is probably the situation that we want to find ourselves in the future. So I think we have to be looking at more radical restructuring. And that radical restructuring has to include, as we see in nearly every other international location, a legislative backing and a constitutional backing. So it needs to be possible for local government to avoid being restructured at any given moment by having its own powers and its own structural capacity to sort of fight back against Scottish government or parliament if that's necessary.
Okay, thanks. Esther.
32 definitely doesn't work. I think we need very local councils. I think we need strategic, take us back to regional council, maybe not that level. In other countries, the local councils decide to share and create those strategic authorities. But picking up on Greg's point, and people might find this odd given that I've chaired more than one health board in my life, in other countries, primary care and public health are not run by the NHS, they're run by local councils. Instead, what we have is 14 territorial health boards, 32 councils and 32 integration authorities that in theory combine health and social care. If public health and primary care sat in local councils where it should, in my view, you wouldn't need 32 integration authorities. So we need to think beyond just local councils as they currently are, and do we need to redraw the boundaries and look at what are the services across the country, because we created all these quangos when we didn't have a parliament, because that was an answer to some more control. But the commitment was that we would review that and reduce the number of quangos and put much more of what they do back into local democratic control. So for me, it's about let's get local, yes, have strategic, but it's about governance of the wider public services, because I don't actually accept, Greg, the premise that either it's more efficient or that it's cheaper in the current model that we have, but you can argue that evidence. And for me, part of the problem you've hit on, which I hadn't thought about, is legislation. This Parliament, because the Scottish Government legislates far too much for things that they don't need to legislate for, and much of that lands on local government to deliver. So I'll come back to that, but I'll be a good girl and follow my 15 seconds.
Yeah, and on that point, I think the single authority model that's being developed in Orkney is coming together and looking at that. There's maybe a direction of travel we can go there.
22,500 of a population in Orkney, and they've got a council, a health board and an integration authority. Yeah. I mean, that's just ludicrous.
Andy.
Yes, I mean, there does need to be restructuring, and I broadly accept Greg's point that the best local democracy is genuinely local. But you do need some strategic working at scale. And most countries deliver that by having counties and municipalities. That's the basic European model. And I like what I call the Lego brick model. I was in Norway years ago when fire and rescue was being taken away from local government. And I asked the local chief executive of a commune of about 2,600 people. And funnily enough, he'd been number 6 in the Foreign Office in Oslo, and he'd moved to be chief executive of a commune. That was not regarded in professional terms as going downhill. He desperately wanted to come home. I said, so you've got your own fire brigade? He looked like he was like completely stupid. He said, oh no, of course not. You know, we cooperate with another 20 municipalities, and we've just joined another one because a new tunnel's been built. So the delivery of services, as opposed to what level they sit at, is the key thing. And I think if you have small enough, you can be adaptable and cooperative. And primary education was delivered differently from fire and rescue. It was delivered differently from planning. But they cooperated and they had that flexibility. And that's what we've not got. We tried to hardwire these things into fixed boundaries and then wonder why things don't work. We need more flexibility. And only that will give you the flexibility.
Okay. Gail.
Yeah, I can't disagree with anything that's been said so far, for sure. And I do think that we need to think beyond our organisational boundaries, and councils are good at that. We have some really good examples of cross-border working, regional economic partnerships. But again, that is taking things away from your actual heart of your community. So your regional economic partnerships in the south of Scotland cover 2 local authorities. What's required in Eyemouth is quite different from what's required in Stranraer. So my view would be that we need to have levels. So we have the organisational boundaries for the policy and the strategy, but then we have tiers below that, or spheres, I think we call them nowadays, for direct operational and on the ground delivery, and I think that that's absolutely crucial.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for a bit of design thinking there on how it could look. That's great. We're going to move on to the next question, which is around implementation gap. And it's a bit of a preamble. So the implementation gap between what's required and what local authorities can deliver can place significant pressure on frontline voluntary organisations. How do we address capacity problems at that local level? Because we're busy talking about, like, we want to move governance much more closely to people and ensure that both public bodies and civil society organisations are empowered and that they have the resources that they need. And Esther, I'm going to ask you to start with that one.
That's a really big challenge, because whilst it's right to say that too often Scottish Government looks at local councils as delivery mechanisms for their policies, there could be claimed that local councils look to the third sector to be the same, and that leaves the third sector in a really, really difficult situation. And I read an article yesterday by Commonweal about the National Care Service and about third sector provision, and we all assume, back to Greg's point, it's cheaper, it's closer to communities, and it isn't always, and sometimes that should be delivered locally. So for me, I think it is absolutely about local councils being able to determine what the best mechanism is to do all of that. And that involves treating the third sector partners as partners, not just as delivery mechanisms. But it does come back to this bit about central government wanting to control everything. And that doesn't work. Power only works like love. Kenyon Wright said this in the convention, if you give it away.
Absolutely. That's a good point. Andy?
Well, that's a big question. I don't think I have any glib sound bites to that. There's a short answer to that, other than to say that if you look across continental Europe, you do not find as big a voluntary sector as you do in the UK as a whole. And the voluntary sector has arisen through the concepts of Victorian charity and paternalism, when councils were very weak. I mean, we only established county councils in the 1890s. But they've persisted. And in large measure, they're doing things today that if you go to Italy or Germany, the local municipality is doing, which is not to say charities in the voluntary sector do not have a role at all. I just think, as Esther said, that too much is being expected of them. And that's not politics. That is simply about capacity, and I think it's trading too much on people's goodwill. It's also weak. We've seen this joint letter this week from 200 third sector organisations or whatever. You've got to have something that's stronger, more statutory, has more powers than the voluntary sector, which by definition is strong in some senses, but on the other hand, quite weak because it doesn't have its own powers.
Well, there's something also about the voluntary sector. The number of conversations I have with voluntary organisations, third sector organisations, about the funding cycle, that it's a year to year. And I mean, I know that's the case with local authority and the Scottish government as well, but with community organisations, it's year to year, and they get the money in October and they're supposed to have spent it by March, and they've got to have reported as well. So there's a very difficult, impossible situation that people are having to manage and actually delivering in an incredible way. And I think one of the things that I just wonder about also is that, just to bring community councils into the mix here, is the remit of a community council too tightly drawn, and should that have been where there was more of a local democratic delivery, and that they had more powers and revenue raising? That's something that's certainly come up at local government conversations at committee. But Gail, if you want to, how do we address capacity problems at that local level?
Yeah, I think the third sector and voluntary sector are picking up services that we used to deliver, and with decades of funding cuts to local government, we actually have to rely on them now. Absolutely, and you touched on the point about year-on-year funding. That doesn't give them the stability either to build capacity within their organisations. So we're looking at our community planning partnerships. They are working quite well in some areas, not so well in others. Certainly in my region, we've really got a much sharper focus on community planning now, and having those partners around the table so that we all know who's delivering what, when they're delivering it, how they're delivering it, and who's paying for it. And I think that community planning space is absolutely vital. But multi-year funding would be helpful as well, so that we can build capacity within those organisations. Because at the moment, the uncertainty for some of them who are delivering really vital services to people with disabilities, to domestic abused individuals, They don't have the capacity either.
Okay. Greg, anything to add?
Not a huge amount. I would just agree with what many of the rest of the panel said about it being the capacity of voluntary organisations being a downstream issue of the lack of capacity in local government more generally, which is essentially due to restricted funding resources. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed at the local government level by Scottish Government and by changes in policy to enshrine financial resilience within councils. And that will include, or is likely to include, further fiscal devolution, as well as multi-year financial settlements, as the rest of the group have already alighted on.
Okay, thanks. Andy, I'm going to come to you for the start of this next question, which is around community empowerment. So the Community Empowerment Act, passed in 2015, aimed to increase participatory decision-making, and yet one of the key findings of the 2024 Democracy Matters consultation was that clear participative mechanisms should be in place to make decisions with various approaches used to maximize accessibility and encourage participation. So that's kind of missing from the mix. But I do think, I just want to highlight that we do have the local place plans, and I know that communities are now creating community action plans and things like that, and that does feel like that's something. But what are your thoughts around real community empowerment? Is that happening in Scotland?
Well, the fact the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government introduced that bill, felt the need to have a bill called on community empowerment is a sign of immense failure. No, there's no other country in Europe has got a community empowerment bill. I mean, they already have community empowerment because every town has their own council. And you can argue about its powers, you can argue about its financing, right? But the fundamental bedrock is there. You mentioned community councils. Community councils, remember, I stand to be corrected in this, but I think they were a late amendment to the 73 Act because a number of councils in Scotland, and remember there was 192, were all being wound up, were furious that they weren't even going to be allowed, their community in Jedburgh or wherever it was, wasn't even going to be allowed to keep its property, right? And that was the common good. So they lost all that, they lost everything, and as a sop, they said, oh, we'll give you community councils so you can talk about things. So let's recognise what community councils are. They're nothing, they have no statutory powers. English parish councils have got much more power. You had a celebrated woman from our online chat thing, I think, in front of your committee. So forget about them. I would say forget about community empowerment. Let's talk about real powers, real finance. And I'm based in Lochaber. I want to be able to go to my nearest town, Roybridge or Fort William, and nobble somebody and get some action. I can't do that because Inverness is a 2-hour drive away.
Gail.
Yeah, absolutely. We've said that councils are the closest form of government, and absolutely we need to engage our individuals and communities in full decision making. I think again it varies across Scotland and it varies across local authorities as well as to how good at that engagement we are. Certainly within participatory budgeting processes, I think that that's a really good example of councils going out to the public. But what we tend to find is that the public only engage when it's something that they are really passionate about. So, if you want to do a consultation on a 4.5-day week, oh boy, will you get 8,000 people responding. But the majority of stuff, it's actually quite hard to engage the public. It tends to only be on something that is particularly contentious and they want to get involved in. So I think it's how do we, as local councillors out there in our towns and villages, whether it be in Tesco on a Saturday afternoon or otherwise, engage with our communities, because folk tend to only want to do it if it's really important to them.
Okay. Thanks. Greg?
First, I want to just come back on what Andy said, that there is another nation that has introduced a community empowerment bill, and it's England, and it's hard to see that as a good sign. But yeah, I would say in terms of local representative democracy, I think it's a really interesting question about how you make sure that everybody is involved. So we've been talking a lot about community representation. I think we need to talk a bit about inclusivity as well. And we've spoken to councils a lot about participatory budgeting. I did a survey on it last year. And one of the things they said about it is that the same types of people always get involved in participatory budgeting. And it's not everybody. There's marginalized communities that you almost never hear from. And the same is actually true with electoral democracy more generally, is that particularly when you have turnouts of 40% or whatever, it tends to be the same 40% of the population that's getting involved, which is why I'm so excited about things like the Citizens' Assembly in Dunfermline, which is an attempt to sort of take another look at a way that we could engage groups. And that's been very successful internationally. So there is opportunities for innovation, I would say, and also technological innovation. I think that's something that will continue to expand over the next few years, to look at how new technologies can be introduced to make sure citizens are as participating in every possible way.
Okay, thanks. Esther?
It's a classic example, as far as I'm concerned, of unnecessary legislation. Community Empowerment Act and community wealth building. If we had proper local councils, those things would be happening without any need for legislation, and that European Charter becomes critical. What the comments have made me realise is I live in a middle-class town in Fife with 10,000 people. I would have a council in any other country. We don't. We have a 4-member ward. The 2 members that live in Dalgety Bay, I don't know who they are, I've never seen them. The 2 that don't, I get a monthly newsletter from them. Beyond that, what opportunity have I had for participation in budgeting, in local place plans? Nothing. We have a community council that seems to do very good work on very local issues, but that should be the Dalgety Bay Council, not the community council, and it should be democratically elected. I'm a huge fan, alongside all of that, of participatory methods. But what I would say, in fairness to councils with strapped budgets, it costs serious money. You cannot do citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries without the funding behind it. And the Dunfermline project's a great one, but it's got money behind it.
Okay, thanks. We've kind of strayed into responding to the final question, so I'm actually going to change it a bit, because I was going to ask you what's holding us back from realising participatory governance, but I think at a local level. But I think you've kind of that's been kind of covered. I think one of the things that I've been reflecting on over the years is kind of like, how do we pay for it, or how do we get that engagement, but how do we expand and make it, as Greg says, more inclusive and get more people involved? And where I go is universal basic income. I feel like that in some ways could unlock a lot more engagement. So I'd be interested to hear, and I'll start with you, Gail. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that, or how do we unlock it? How do we get more people engaging? There might be other ideas that you have.
It's very difficult because, as I say, people tend to only be interested in something that they're particularly interested in, or if a hospital's going to close. But I think it comes back to what we've been discussing right from the start. We need more councils, more local, with greater presence and representation from local representatives. And we're doing a really good job in Dumfries and Galley. We have a really proactive youth council now, which meets with the Community Planning Partnership Board. They come along to area committees. We've created a system of ward workers who know the ward, who pull all the community groups together, to look at local place plans. They keep us updated as local members, so we're not being constantly badgered, but not badgered, but contacted by community groups. And I think that whole coordination of local is absolutely what we need to be doing.
Okay, thanks. Greg?
Yeah, I think some of the international research is really interesting on this, which is that trust and participation tends to increase as satisfaction with delivery also increases. So often people will be more likely to participate in an organisation that it looks like might be able to deliver in whatever their priorities are. And I think that's where we come back to, and I'm sorry to harp on about this, but we come back to the financial position of councils. So it's difficult for councils to sort of build up trust and build up participatory mechanisms or whatever else might be needed in their local area if they don't have the funding to do so, and if they don't have the funding to deliver sort of unique or bespoke local solutions in the way that they, in my view, should be able to.
Okay, thanks. Esther?
Come back to boring Dalgety Bay in my middle-class community. If we had a council, we would have a dozen people, maybe, locally engaged. The statistic that threw me when I got involved in a group called Build a Local Scotland was 1,200 councillors in Scotland. Norway has the same population. It has 12,000 councillors. Now, the real key is, going back to where we used to be, those councillors are not full-time. Because you have so many more and they're so much more local, they do it part-time, they're much more well-known locally, they're much more engaged, but it also means that a far, far bigger proportion of the general population stands for election. People turn over, and that in itself creates engagement. And it does mean you go in, and there was a woman from Norway at one of our events said, I'm accountable. I go to my shopping centre on a Saturday morning, and I think of me in our local Tesco. I should be able to see my councillors there. And I think if we did that and engaged more people in the whole process and made standing as a councillor much more accessible, more people would get engaged, and that would begin to spread confidence and trust.
Thanks. Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I agree with everything that's been said already. I mean, just picking up the point about the local, I mean, I mean, if you're in the shopping centre or go to the football match or pick your kids up from school in a commune in Norway, you will probably every week meet at least one person who's a councillor. And it's not just that you can nobble them. I don't know if councillors like being nobbled in Tesco or whatever, but the point is, of the sort of 27% pence in the pound tax you pay in Norway, 12 pence goes straight. Well, actually, it gets collected by Oslo, and then it's just an administrative function they provide. But it goes straight to the commune. So these people are not just making decisions about building houses or sewage plants or whatever it might be. They're actually spending your money. And until you've got politicians in a position that they're spending significant amounts of your money, right, you're not going to get the kind of accountability that I think we should have. For the decisions people make, because the distance is too great.
Okay, thanks for that. All right, so we have set the scene. I feel like in general we're kind of, there's a consensus here. We know from the opening comments that things need to change, and from Greg's point, radically, and some really interesting points there around the technology that's changing, the fact that we're in the middle of a climate and nature crisis. So we're going to now open the floor to you. We have a roving microphone. And what I'll do is I'll take a couple of questions at a time. And so if you can keep your hands up until we come to you, that would be great. So we've got a question over here. Yes, exactly. You're going to the right person. Thank you so much. And then it will come to this person in the front row over here. Okay.
Hello. Can you hear me? Is
yes.
it switched on? Yeah. Okay. Right. I have to say, listening to this discussion, I feel enormously frustrated. I'm not alone in the fact that for the whole of my working life, which is now about 40-odd years in rural development across particularly the Highlands and Islands, but across Scotland, and also internationally across Europe, we have been talking about these issues. We have realised that Scotland and Britain as a whole is structured badly. It always has been. We have talked about it and never done a damn thing about it. Andy's right, community councils are powerless, forget them. They were designed to be powerless. They are not local government. We have worked, Andy and myself have done a lot of work with Norway. Norway is the most incredible example. The Scottish, our Scottish government at the moment have always looked, apparently, to Scandinavia, but they never do anything about it. And many people, including Andy and myself and others, have actually talked about this. Now, if you look at the situation in some of these countries, what you're finding is that it's not only about the fact they've got local municipalities, which are critical. It's the powers and the funding that are allocated to them. And one thing we've not even mentioned here is that local authorities in these Scandinavian countries have the powers to raise their own money. They can tax all kinds of things. They have dog taxes, they have land taxes, property taxes. They own the rights to do what they want with hydropower. So they gain the income from hydropower. They can have public-private partnerships, or they can run it themselves, or they can take taxes from it. So they're taking local resources from their area to make money so they can run local services. And I know municipalities in the middle of nowhere.
Wind up. Really, really important points.
But my question is, why have we known about these things for so long and we never act on it? And I see no sign of any clear movement to act on any of this at the moment.
Thank you very much for that question. And we'll come to, yes, very good point. So we're going to come, okay, yes, great.
Thank you. I think my question's about where the power is. You've mentioned power a few times today, and you talk about democratically elected councils, but by that, presumably, we mean councillors. But I know many people who have stepped up to be a councillor because they're big in local community activism and are very, very disappointed and frustrated that they actually don't get to make the changes that they expected to make. And actually they find that the council officers pretty much tell them what it is that they've got to do. And you're right about community councils. No respect there for community councils. I don't believe that there's respect for local place plans. To me, it feels like, I'm not sure where the power is. Sometimes it sits with the council officers and then they don't have the funding to do the things that they want to do anyway.
Okay, thanks. All right, so we've got a couple of questions there. Vanessa expressing her frustration. Absolutely, we have been having this conversation for a long time. So what is it? Can we unearth that today? I'm not sure, because we have been having this conversation for a long time. Why haven't we taken that action? And also, I think a really good point, where does the power lie? yeah, where does the power lie? So I'll start with you, Esther.
I share your frustration. There is absolutely no doubt. As I've said, 30 years of my adult life, I've been pushing for this. And if I was being benevolent about it, I would say that on reflection, maybe the creation of a new parliament inevitably led to a sense of feeling that everything had to be done here in Holyrood and that the power had to sit here. And if I say that one thing that has changed that was not what we expected was the turnover of MSPs. We actually thought about having term limits. We decided that would not be a good idea. It would have been pointless. Can count, I suspect, on a couple of hands how many MSPs there will be next May that have been here since 1999. So I think there's a whole learning curve goes on and new people, and it leaves the power in the hands of political parties and government. And we've had all sorts of different configurations of government. So for me, it comes back to that history and culture and wanting to keep control, whether it's here or at Westminster. And I believe the only way we'll change that is from the bottom up. Communities need to understand that that will be what will change things. And at the moment, they don't see it, which is perfectly understandable. Power, I think, is absolutely the heart of all of it, and I believe we need to start giving it away. Government needs to start doing the things that only they can do and recognise that local councils and local communities know what's best for them in a whole raft of areas. And coming back to your point about councillors, I think you're absolutely right. I have friends just like you who've given up because they feel they've got no power. But that's back to the whole point about political parties and councils being too big. So I have a council with 75 members. And it's run by the Labour administration, hands up, used to be a Labour Party person. They've got 20 councillors out of 75. Where does that leave the other 55? And that was not what we expected of PR, and I'm in favour of PR. But again, I think if we had the kind of communes that Andy's describing, like in Norway, those people that stood for council would be in control and they would feel that they could make a real difference. But if you're one in a council of 75 or 120 or whatever the biggest is, then it's very difficult to feel as a kind of backbencher you're having any input at all.
Okay, thanks. Just to say to the panel, you don't necessarily have to answer both questions and you don't necessarily have to come in, but I will, yeah, Gail.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to come in. Esther, I think you've actually touched on a really important point around proportional representation. We have minority councils in Scotland now, and minority councils don't make good decisions. To make good decisions, you kind of need to have a little bit more power at local level. So what we're finding in Dumfries and Galloway is that anything that needs to be done that is radical and could give better service delivery, if it's slightly unpopular in the first instance, you're not going to get it over the line. It's going to get voted down in full council. So I think that the minority council structure has actually been problematic at best. Schemes of delegation within our councils, and what is delegated to officers. As councillors, we're not allowed to get involved in operational matters. If we're not allowed to get involved in operational matters, that's fine, but I need to know that they are delivering. So I think we need to look at our schemes of delegation, what is delegated to officials and what we retain essentially some decision-making powers over. And I think that that has slightly skewed and it's taken less power away from the elected representative and put more power into our very hard-working staff, but it means that we're not as accountable.
Okay, thanks. Very briefly, Esther is going to come back on that, and then I'll see if Andy and Greg want to come in.
A comment and a question, which might help Andy will be to answer. My comment is I don't think minority government is the problem. We campaigned for a parliament that would have minority government, but we believed we'd have a parliament that would be collaborative and that people would work together for what was right for the country. And to me, I would be curious to know in Norway, party politics gets in the way of so much of this. If you've got a council of a commune for 10,000 people, do those councillors belong to political parties or are they independents like we used to have in Highlands and elsewhere?
Well, Greg might know more about this, but the last time I looked, I think across Germany and Italy and places, yes, political parties are standing locally, but they have much less. Often the party that is local in the local Länder or the county, the department, or whatever, is actually a different party than nationally. You know, the national parties don't stand, etc. But there's a lot of independence as well, particularly when you get to smaller councils. I mean, I think the answer to your question is quite blunt. There has not been the political will to do this. Okay, so the case has to be made, and the case has to be made by citizens, okay, saying we want to take back control, you know. And I think we're far too polite. I think when the Parliament came along, I experienced this when I was here, people would come along and they're very polite and deferential to power. You know, you'd say, well, what's on your agenda? What are you trying to do? Oh, we're waiting for the government to issue a consultation. Well, why are you waiting? Well, why don't you just write what should be done? So I think we need to be more assertive is one answer to that. But you've got serious political problems. There was a senior cabinet minister came to your committee, Ariane, recently, defending ring fencing on the basis that there was too much of a postcode lottery in Scotland, and if people weren't getting the services they'd expect he and the Scottish Government got it in the neck. Now, I hate this term postcode lottery. Different councils should be able to do what they want, and if it's not working, their citizens should hold them to account. The idea that Boris Johnson would ever say there's too much of a postcode lottery in Britain, in the UK with regard to healthcare or whatever, we're going to tell Scotland what to do. I mean, that same cabinet minister would be furious at that suggestion. So I think there's an intellectual vacuum here as well. People are not being serious enough about this issue, and they're also not being serious enough about thinking about the potential of genuine empowerment, because genuine empowerment can fix problems. It can enhance people's real capacity to handle power. You know, the trade unions have got less membership, the churches have got less membership, political parties have got less membership, we've got fewer councils than we ever had. So the opportunities for people to feel what power is and how to exercise it responsibly, how to cooperate, how to collaborate, those opportunities are few and far between now.
Okay, thanks. Greg, do you want to come in?
Yeah, please. Just to come back on the first question, I think it's such an interesting question. What does it actually take for change to happen? And we had a look internationally at when there were major changes to local government structures across different countries. And one of the things we found is that in places like, I mean, there's a few of them that you definitely no one would want to happen. Like in Germany, it was a major catastrophic war and then the reunification of a country after a long time. We don't, obviously, we're not saying that sort of thing is likely. But what happened in Italy or Japan is essentially local government financially collapsed. And then they said, well, we can't allow this to, the national government had to step in and say, it can't be allowed to be like this again. We have to embed autonomy, make local government more financially sustainable. And I think the issue is in Scotland is that we've been, or at least our finance surveys, which speak to councillors and officers across Scotland, they've basically been coming back to us and saying, we are near that state of financial collapse, at least in a few councils. And the thing that we should be saying at this point is maybe we should change before that happens. Maybe we shouldn't wait for the collapse, which is what they did in Japan, essentially, is wait for it to already be too late. So, yeah, I mean, I would say, essentially, if our predictive powers are that good, I think we should be talking about changing right now before it's too late. I'm certain that there wouldn't be too much disagreement about that. On the question of where is power, I'm just going to bring this back to the finances again. So the same story that we hear over and over again from councillors across Scotland is that they get into office, and at the first stage that they're asked to make a decision, it's what should we cut? Because that is the primary decision that is going on in councils at the moment because of their financial situation. And that really isn't a form of power at all. And I think that's where the financial situation that councils find themselves in is inevitably linked to the amount of power that they have.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so we're going to get the roving mics out again and a couple of questions. I want to go right to the back and the person who is almost under the clock. As a first one, and then a second person over here. Yeah, keep your hand up there so that person with their hand up will be the second question. Okay.
Just quickly to say, I think to lay any problems at the door of the electoral system in Scotland is a kind of misdiagnosis. It's all about scale. I mean, I can see in England where they have first past the post and worse problems. It's about the size of the wards rather than the way they're elected. We should have, representatives that represent the way people voted. But that's not really my main point. My main point is that when I was in Denmark over the summer, I was talking to an academic, a political scientist who did comparative politics there, and he told me that the Danish child poverty rate is 3%. One in 5 child in Scotland lives in poverty. And why that is relevant, I think it should always be relevant, but it's relevant because I asked him what he thought the difference between the UK and Denmark was, and he said, the sites of power in Denmark are shared out. So you have stronger trade unions, you have very strong local government that represents communities, and they're able to address the power, the sets of interests that would centralise an economy and centralise a government and protect the status quo in a way that allows that economy and that society to run in a way that allows 1 in 5 children to live in poverty. So I think it's really important that we are able to give power out to our communities and to other sites of power who are really able to represent the people.
Okay, that was really a comment, but we can pick up, I think, a very important comment. And the next question is down over here.
Hi, thanks. I just want to reflect on what Esther said about power only working effectively in the same way as love does, which is when you give it away, and comment on the fact that that requires real relational intelligence and competencies to achieve. So my question is, in a world that's currently plagued by misinformation and rising social division, what strategies to foster relational competencies should Scotland's national and local power-holding spheres of governance prioritise to foster effective and equitable power sharing and relationships across our communities, councils, governments and parliament? Remembering that at the moment we're living in a particularly challenging world where I feel, and I know that lots of people do not feel, that they have similar levels of access to either power or love or care or compassion across our communities.
Yeah, great questions. So, yeah, relationship question. Who wants to pick that up? And it's lovely because the point at the back around giving the power away and this question about, Gail.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to start, but just to touch on the child poverty stats as well. No child should live in poverty, absolutely not. And 1 in 5 does seem very stark, but I think sometimes it's how we measure those statistics. So, in Scotland, we measure it on free school meals. We've had a rollout of universal free school meals, so that's put that stat up. So I'm not sure it's totally reflective of the actual position, but until we start to take the data in a different way, that measurement isn't terribly helpful sometimes. I think in terms of relationships, I was council leader for 26 months. As I say, I've been a councillor for 18 years. The key thing is good relationships. And I would say that 98% of what we determine in the chamber is done by consensus and by us all working together and communicating and getting on with each other. One of the challenges that we do have, and it's going back to political party affiliation, am I doing what's in line with my national party's line on something? And that can be quite a challenge because they may have a position nationally that I think is a load of nonsense locally, and we want to implement something locally. So I think building those relationships within councils is important, but also having those relationships with your hierarchical structures to say, we're going to do this in Dumfries and Galloway. I know it's not Conservative policy, but it's the right thing for my region. And I think sometimes just being bold is what we have to do.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else want to come in?
Oh, definitely.
Okay, Esther.
Given where the question came from, I'll come to that one in a minute. A very quick comment about Willie's point about Denmark, though, and Andy will correct me if I've got this wrong. Power goes with the money. We've already heard that. And local councils within the Scotland Act could have all sorts of powers to raise taxes. And the story that shocked me to the core was learning that our biggest landowner, who is the richest individual in Scotland, is Danish. And he pays taxes on 250,000 acres of our land to the Danish government. That might be one of the reasons why Danish children don't live in poverty. So, lay that aside. Coming back to your question, and lovely to hear from you, I think it comes back to something that's already been said. I think it was Andy that made the point. We have been powerless for too long as a nation. And I really thought the Scottish Parliament would start that rebuilding of the confidence in the agency. And I suspect in some ways it has, but not universally. And we've still got far too many communities that feel completely powerless, struggling day to day to feed their children, to wonder if they'll have work tomorrow, to wonder whether they'll still have a roof over their head. And I think it comes back to that point about if we put power back in proper local communities, that will be what will begin to strengthen those relationships by giving people power and agency over their own lives and their own communities and rebuilding some of the connections that we've lost. Because I think that's absolutely where it starts. And it scares me how far away from that we are.
Okay. Andy?
I mean, on the relationship point, it's really, really good. I have no easy answers to this other than to observe, which is quite well known, really, that people do come together to oppose things more than they do to build things. And I was at a conference years ago in Fife. It was an environmental conference, and it was about local environmental initiatives. And I got the sense after a while, it was all done, everyone was stalls. Everyone was having a go at Fife Council because it wasn't doing something or should be doing it, whatever. And Fife Council was facing some difficult decisions at that point. I mean, they wanted to build various things. I can't remember what they were. I mean, an incinerator or whatever it was. There was various things that they wanted to do, and nobody wanted them in their patch, right? But they were taking all the brickbats. And we developed a model which is to say, well, okay, so Fife Council needs to do this. Everyone accepts they need to do it. That wasn't the issue. But why not give it to all those environmental groups and community groups and say, you come forward, you do some negotiation, you work it out. And it's amazing what happens when you give people a problem to fix. I sat in the Commission to Local Tax Reform, and we had panels about the council tax, local income tax, and all the rest of it. And it was remarkable how quickly people grasped what, to my mind, I thought were quite complex issues, but they weren't complex at all. And it's amazing how quickly people were able to work through. So I think one thing we could do in a relationship is give more people more opportunity to diagnose problems. Because I think the problem in this place is a misdiagnosis of problems far too often. And the closer you can get to the root of it, the better. On the Danish question, yes, I've got figures on how much Danes in the UK are paying. Danish citizens have to pay tax on any land they own anywhere in the world. So yes, the Scottish Danes are one of the biggest taxpayers in Denmark, and they're paying nothing to their own local council, which is bizarre. And then talking about fiscal powers, I mean, we need to hand non-domestic rates back to local councils. I mean, it's a nonsense that I was ever centralised. There were reasons for it at the time. But you've got, Sheikh bin Rashid Al Maktoum, he's the ruler of Dubai. He claims small business bonus scheme.
Getting slowly.
Sheikh bin Rashid Al Maktoum, he's the ruler of Dubai. He's eligible to claim small business bonus scheme on his properties. So, but this gets to diagnosis, and I think one of the problems. Sorry, I'm going to. There's not. This sounds bizarre, but there's not enough academic and think tank and policy work in Scotland. There's some. It's good, but there's not enough. It's not. Some of it is not serious enough. The biggest problem is that politicians are not actually, I don't think, look to the next election. You'll be entering this messy period now where you build manifestos. What a horrible process that is. I mean, if you realise the process that goes, no, we need to do something that will keep these people here, something that we can. There's no seriousness to a lot of this stuff. And I think some of these issues are long-term. Health and social care, local democracy, these are long-term strategic projects. And we should be building cross-party consensus on 10 and 20 programmes for reform. And I think actually privately you speak to politicians, they would all agree with that. It's a question of operationalising that. Look at, 2007 we're going to abolish the council tax. Here we are 20 almost years later.
You talked about the manifesto process, which we are busy in the middle of, and I do think more people need to understand that process exists and how it gets influenced, and then therefore how an election is run and how parties stand on those manifestos. I don't really get a sense, and I think this has come to light across this morning's conversation. People don't really understand the electoral system for their local authority. They don't understand for the Scottish Parliament. It's confusing, that part, and then the manifesto bit, and how the public discourse is influenced, and how ideas float to the surface to become a bit of legislation.
Could I ask a question? Has anybody done an analysis of what manifestos actually ever get implemented?
Well, actually, we are in the Scottish Greens, I'm not sure if I can say that, but we are doing that. We're looking at what have we actually done that we've achieved. So I think there is an important bit of looking back on those things. Greg, do you want to come in on anything?
Could I come in on the relationship point? So I think a type of relationship that we haven't really spoken about yet is the relationship between central and local government. So in this case, Scottish Government and Scottish councils. And I think the point that I would make, if we were to compare it again to a romantic relationship, is that it's almost impossible to have a relationship where there's such a stark power imbalance. And I think we only have to look there to a couple of years ago, where we had the sort of warm glow period of the Verity House Agreement, where it really looked like everything was, coming together, and there was a strong consensus around what needed to happen with local government. And this is the results of our survey that we did in the same year into the views of local government. The surprise announcement of the council tax freeze just a few months later, which should not be in the gift of Scottish Government to do, was devastating to the relationships between central and local government, according to the results of our survey. And I think that's a case of where the structures that are in place can really affect the capacity to build a relationship. Because if Scottish Government wasn't able to do that, then that relationship would have been in a situation where it wouldn't have to go through such a turbulent period.
Yeah, I think that is a very good point. That was a disappointing moment that took place. Okay, we've got some more questions, and I've got one person, this gentleman here at the front, and who am I going to go for? Gosh, put your hands really up high. So at the back, the person, not all the way back, yeah, that row, but in towards that person. Thank you.
I'm going to take you literally at having contrary views expressed, because I speak as someone who was chief officer in local government and then elected leader of a council, and I was extremely effective at acquiring power and resources and perhaps implementing what I thought was right. And subsequently, I served on the Accounts Commission for Scotland, which oversees, as you know, local government and so on. And now I'm in a position where I don't represent anybody. I think I've come to the conclusion that the biggest problem is that local government power holders are more involved in the delivery of the services than they are in the scrutiny of the services and the representative of the community. So I very much support the idea of local community councils being empowered, but I do wonder whether it is right that the local authorities are the service deliverers. And is there any merit at all in making local government very much the advocates and scrutineers? By controlling the budget, of course, they may be the allocated budget, but not necessarily so much involved with the deliverers, because I had many councillors whose first reaction was to support the staff they were responsible for, understandably, rather than the people who they represented.
Hi, yeah, I just had a question. We've been talking a bit about like the future of local councils and that development, and I was just sort of wondering how that also fits in with trying to reach out to young people more, because I feel like myself and other young people, whenever we try and engage in local councils and local government, we find the rooms, in the nicest possible way, look a lot like this, and I feel deeply that there's sort of a big gap there, and that a lot of people don't, like young people don't engage with local government because they're not seeing how that is manifesting sort of locally for them, and just, yeah, I guess what's going on in that area as well.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much. I think that's a really important point. I know that conversation I'm having constantly, people are asking how do we get more young people engaged, so great question there. And then also this other question and point around whether local government should actually be the deliverers or rather scrutinising. I think that's what I picked up. I'm not sure then who would deliver, but okay. Andy.
Yeah, well, the first question, I mean, that's a perennial problem because, I mean, unlike the executive and the parliament, the executive sits within the parliament. It works in a different building, although some of them sit here, but they are elected members of the parliament, and the parliament does the scrutiny. You don't have that in local government to the same extent, but you can. I mean, it's up to local government how it structures scrutiny functions. You can have any scrutiny function you like. That's the good thing, right? The Parliament and the Scottish Government can't. They're constrained by the Scotland Act. So I would put it back to local people, local communities and local councils. Scrutiny is always a good thing. You know, audit is always a good thing. Always a good thing. On the second question about young people, I mean, I take that point. It's very encouraging to see, I think, the youngest council leader in Scotland and Shetland Islands Council, female. So it's not like there's nobody involved. We've had some, but Shetland's got a bit different because it's kind of had a more of a tradition of autonomy and all the rest of it. But I mean, I think part of this gets down to the fact that our councils are too big and too remote. So I mean, if you're a young person living in Dalry or wherever, or in Stranraer or wherever, I mean, this centre of power is a long, long way away. Again, you're not meeting these people on a daily basis. And there's not much incentive, I don't think, not just for young people, but for older people as well, to get involved, which gets back to the past point about powers.
Okay.
Can I just pick up on the young people's point, and I do think Greg may well have more evidence on this, but from the work that Andy and others and Leslie Riddick and Nordic Horizons and the like have done, my understanding is that where you do have smaller local councils, more and more young people stand, especially if that's not requiring them to be full-time. Because one of the challenges local councils have is that they've now got so much responsibility that they are ending up having to be full-time, and that means a whole raft of people, whether it's women who are carers or whether it's young people or people who are building their own careers, can't give up the time to be a councillor. Whereas if we go back to the situation where you can do your council responsibilities part-time in the evenings or whatever, I think more young people would get involved. And again, they would also see more point in being involved because they would see the difference that that council could be making to their lives.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Touch on that. Yeah, I think it's a really important point, but we can't get away from the fact that it depends on what your role is within local government. So if you're an opposition backbencher, you probably have a lot more time to maybe do a second job. If you're the leader of a council, which I have been, or you're in administration, you don't have time to do another job. So bluntly, the bottom line is we need to pay councillors more. We've had to shift up in the last couple of years, but it's marginal. You know, the basic salary for a councillor is less than the national minimum wage. And I think until we have something that's more level, and believe me, I work longer hours than a lot of opposition backbench MSPs, and I get about a third of the salary. You know, so I think we have to be really honest about that and actually value our local representatives a little bit more as well.
Yeah, I think, and I was hearing yesterday of a councillor who had 27 reports to read for a day-long committee. Yeah, and yeah, so I think that's another thing is that we talk about councillors, we talk about MSPs, but we never actually get down to actually what is the workload. And also I think your point about parsing out that if you're in a different role, you're a councillor but in a different role, then there's a different workload there as well. But Greg, you were cited there as maybe having some more input, so I'll bring you in.
I'll try to add some more insight. So I think Esther is exactly right on a couple of mechanisms that can work to involve young people, but also any other kind of marginalised community in council work. So it's making it work around people's lives and also making it clearer the ways in which council work can affect people's lives, people like them. And I think that part of that comes down to the power question. I also think something we haven't mentioned yet on this, and the international evidence is relatively clear on this, is that political parties play a major role in engaging people in politics at a local level. And I think that's a really interesting case. So if you look at how, for example, the number of women candidates in local elections in England has exploded over the last few years, and that is primarily driven by the Labour Party instigating their own efforts to make sure that more women are involved. And that's something that could be instigated across the piece by political parties if they had the will to do so. And I'm certain that there are certain political parties or certain local places where this is happening.
Okay, thanks. So we've got time for one more question before we go to closing remarks. And I've got a person in the front, in the second row from the front here. Can you put your hand up and then they can see you coming?
Thank you all for all you've been saying. I have a wonder, frankly, that UBI would improve engagement. I frankly don't think it would. And the views of the other panel members would be interesting. But my question relates to the earlier remarks about liaison with the third sector. Yes, in the Southwest, the TSI has done an astonishing job with a very remarkable woman leading it, who, of course, at one time was a councillor here in Edinburgh. But that doesn't happen everywhere, which begs the question as to the value of the quite astonishing number of charities there are in Scotland, and whether there shouldn't be, and it's perhaps a question for Tobias's meeting on Friday, amalgamation or much more scrutiny. The number now is beyond comprehension, and I wonder if any of you have observations on that.
Okay, thanks for that question. And thanks for bringing it to the third sector, bringing them in at the closing here. Anyone want to pick that up?
It's quite a controversial one, isn't it? Because, as I say, a lot of our third sector and voluntary sector are delivering absolutely vital services, but equally some of them are duplicating what we're already doing. And I think, again, it's incumbent on me as a decision maker to scrutinise what is going on in my area, to have reports come to committee to enable us to see where the spend is going and what the impact of that is on the user, and then look to where the duplication is. And we see that across the economic landscape, we see it across, service delivery. So I think that audit and scrutiny role about what we're doing in our communities, who's doing it, and are we duplicating, which is not good value for money, that needs to be at the absolute heart of what I do as an elected member.
Something I notice in my area is that it becomes challenging when you have a lot of organisations, that there's fewer and fewer people to be on the boards, and each organisation struggling to having those people to take on those roles of responsibility. Anybody else want to come in on that question? Greg?
Yeah, so I'm not qualified to speak about the effect that UBI would have, but I've read an extremely interesting article that I would recommend everybody have a look at about universal basic infrastructure by the economist Diane Coyle, which is extremely interesting. And it's essentially asking the question, not what would happen if we gave everybody a certain amount of money to cover them, but what would we need, like, what public infrastructure does everybody need, and how would we invest to make sure that everybody has it? And it's a fantastic piece of work looking at an equally radical but very different proposition.
Okay, thanks very much for that. So I think I've not got any other takers on responding to that question. I'm going to move to closing remarks. So I just want to say thank you for all your contributions. But before we close, what we're going to do is going to do a quick fire 1 minute sum up. So I think a way I'll phrase this is we part of the point of these conversations, and we touched on it earlier, is about influencing public discourse. So if you really had 1 minute to influence public discourse, what do you feel you want to say here today that people who are listening will take away and go and share the news with their friends and family? So I'm going to start with Esther, and I'm just going to move across, and I'll end with you, Greg, online. Esther.
I think, given the way you've posed the question, we've maybe partially answered it already. So if it's about influencing public discourse, I think it comes back to a point that Andy made earlier. We need, all of us who believe this is right, and many of the people that work in this building who believe that it's right, to go back to the structure of local governance in its widest sense. And we need to begin to engage in local debate and discussion that fires people up to think actually it is something that would matter to them and would make a huge difference to their lives, and that they need to start being less polite and demanding that we finally get implementation. And I think we've barely touched on it, but for me, the council tax debacle is one classic. Everybody agrees we need to be rid of it, we need to have something fairer, and yet there's no demand and no pressure from the public to force government and parliament to implement it. So I think we as citizens have to begin to get that debate going out there in the public realm.
Okay, thanks. Andy?
I think we need to learn a lot more, be more serious, and do a lot more diagnostics and proper understanding about how power works. I think we're quite poor in this country. I've spoken to people who are meant to know about how power works, and they don't. I mean, I don't pretend that I do either, but I think we need to be more serious. And finally, I told a story in a blog years ago about the 8 Scottish boroughs, Jedburgh, Roxburgh, Peebles, Hawick, etc., and looked at their common good funds, which is their historic legacy from their establishment. And if you add them all up, all 8, it comes to less than Berwick has. Berwick has more funds, more income, and more land than all of the rest put together. And the difference is that Berwick's in England. So I suppose, yeah, maybe more folks should join England. No, but I mean, they're historic. It still has a council. It still has all its land, and it's got a lot of money coming in. Owns all the land around Berwick. Every time there's a housing development, it gets a couple of million quid or 3-4 million quid, right? None of the rest of Scottish borders councils, towns have got anything. They've lost it all. So that's why we need to kind of learn and understand better and do a lot more cross-boundary learning and understanding about how to build a better democracy. I don't think we can jump there very quickly.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'm not going to repeat what Andy said. I think at the absolute nub for me, it's about trying to devolve more back to our local communities. I think we've all got consensus on that today. And Greg touched on the point of income generation for councils. We don't have the power to bring in additional funds. So when your pothole doesn't get filled because it's less a priority than care at home, we need to have that mechanism to bring more money into local councils. But I think the key thing, and it's been raised before, is short-termism. We do have politicians who only look as far as the next election. We're already in the campaign run for the Scottish Parliament election next year. That shouldn't affect me as a local councillor, but it does. It does affect us because decisions are not being made nationally that impact on us locally. So we do need to have 10, 20, 30-year plans, and me not being precious about whether I get re-elected in 2027 or not.
Okay, thanks. And Greg?
Yeah, so we did a survey of Scottish councils at the end of 2024, and 70% of respondents said they may be unable to pass a balanced budget in the next 5 years. So this isn't a problem that is in the major long term. At some point very soon, councils are telling us that they will be financially unsustainable, which means that a decision will have to be made immediately about how they are going to be made financially sustainable. And I think lots of what we've spoken about today will be part of the solution there, particularly in terms of fiscal devolution, particularly in terms of legislating to make sure that local councils have powers that cannot simply be taken away, and they can't be granted extra responsibilities at a moment's notice. I really think that if people are to take one thing away from the public discourse, is that we really need to be thinking about this now if we value the services that local governments deliver, and if we value local democracy as a means by which the public interacts with their government.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I think that conversation about fiscal powers for councils has been happening in the Parliament in this session, and I think there is something about cross-party agreement and the urgency to jump and move towards that and kind of bring that about. But I'm going to have to bring us to a close now. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our panelists, Esther Robertson, Andy Whiteman, Councillor Gail McGregor, and Dr. Greg Stride, for an insightful discussion. And I think we did get, as Gail, you said, we got a bit of consensus here. And I think a big piece of the consensus is that action needs to happen. There's a frustration here, but I also really want to kind of put that to all of us. How do we all help the action happen? How do we influence the public discourse in our communities to say, yeah, we want change, and get other people understanding that we can, instead of staying frustrated about it, that we can agitate, or you can kind of agitate me and everybody else around we want that change, and that's something that maybe we should be seeing showing up strongly in the Scottish Parliament elections. So I also want to thank our partners, COSLA and the Scottish Future Forum, for this event. And that's where you all get to applaud. Just briefly before you all run out the door, I just want to ask you to complete the survey. Please use the QR codes. There's one at the door here, or ask festival assistants for a paper copy. It's very important for us to hear your feedback on what you thought of this session and the festival in general. There's many more events taking place until Friday the 22nd. And at 1:15 today, the Scottish Future Forum will be hosting a discussion on the future of health innovations. And at 5:30, there will be considering whether artificial intelligence will support or supplant human participation in politics. So we heard Greg talk about that already. So please enjoy the rest of the festival, and thanks for coming this morning.